Hi guys, welcome to the wood shop. Today I'm going to show you how to sharpen a bandsaw blade. This particular blade has a 12-foot circumference, and I got this from Cook's Blades. And I just told them I had a Harbor Freight sawmill and they sent me the blade. It is about an inch in width and about a millimeter in thickness. I want to say these teeth are about a 1/4 inch. So what is the anatomy of a blade? Let's start there. You have the tooth, which is the peak right there, and you have the kerf, this area right here, this valley. And what the valley does is it actually contains the bit of wood that gets cut away. So without this kerf here, it wouldn't really cut very well, because even if something is sharp, if there's nowhere to put the piece you're removing, then it doesn't cut very well. So what else can I tell you about these? They're actually ribbons of metal that get the teeth cut into them and are then welded together. And you can see here it actually snapped at the weld for this particular blade. Generally, that can mean a few things. It can mean that the diameter of your wheels is so small that it just really stresses out the metal, and the fatigue property will cause it to snap. You can see here it's actually a very nice, neat, straight line where it broke. It can also mean that you have it over-tensioned and you're putting so much stress on it that it just snaps apart. And I can tell you it's a habit that when you aren't getting a good straight cut, you'll think you need to tension the blade more. However, that only works so much. It's generally the case that the blade is dull. However, there is one other time that even with a sharp blade you'll get a bad cut, and that's when the wood that's being pulled into the kerf is not escaping. So what I do is I actually use a lubricant on the blade so that the wood wants to just come right off of the kerf area. Otherwise it sort of gets plastered with wood, and I found this a particularly big issue when milling pine that's fresh, because the resin acts like a gummy glue and the fibers of wood actually wrap around the tooth. When a blade gets hot, the steel is weakened temporarily. It means that when the blade is moving quickly, friction is created between the blade and the piece you're cutting. And although it's less of an issue with a bandsaw, so you don't generally need to wedge, it is still an issue. So temperature builds up. That's why bandsaws use water for coolant, at least bandsaw mills. Water is actually a decent lubricant as well. However, I don't think it's good enough to keep the wood fibers from sticking in the kerf. So I began using things like garage door spring lubricants and things along those lines, and I think WD-40 would also make a lot of sense because the WD stands for water displacement. So these blades tend to rust up quite a bit. And initially I was really worried about slippage, but slippage is actually less of an issue than you might think, because when these get hot, it causes them to slip anyway. So I haven't had any kind of slipping issues from using lubricant additionally, and it's going to keep the blade running longer and stay sharper longer. So what am I using for sharpening? This is just a chainsaw sharpener by Harbor Freight. They run around $20 to $30 depending on sale. And it's just a little grinding wheel. Now the angle I find is not ideal for bandsaw blades for the mill, but it's not that big of a deal. What I do is essentially just freehand this blade, hitting each tooth. And that's pretty much just the quickest way to do it. I would say that you're going to be permanently disfiguring your blades by sharpening them manually. There's nothing much you can do about that, because when you're sharpening manually, you're not getting machine precision, which is how these are initially ground. However, there are many times, even if you have access to a commercial sharpener, that you may need to get a blade sharpened immediately. For example, maybe you need to wrap up a cut in the field and all you have is a chainsaw sharpener or a file or something along those lines. You could still finish it up. I'll actually be able to finish up probably an oak tree per blade if I'm not hitting any metal, but a lot of the trees around here, because they were used for farming and hanging, fencing and that sort of thing, there's a lot of iron right in the core, and even with a handheld metal detector, it's pretty difficult to pinpoint and know exactly where that's going to be. So how sharp should these teeth be? After milling and doing a lot of manual sharpening, I would say they should be about the sharpness of a thorn on a rose bush. So they should stick you a little bit. For example, this is pretty sharp, but I can still apply pressure and it's not penetrating my skin. It's quite sharp, and it's still not sharp enough in my opinion. So the major issues with freehand sharpening that I have found so far is you'll have a tendency to want to grind away a large area to conform it to the angle of the blade. And admittedly, there are ways that I could get that angle closer, but what I've realized is it doesn't really add any benefit. What you want to do is just kiss the tip of the tooth with it so that you get that thorn sharpness. And you don't even want to hold it against it for a long period of time, because what happens is there's such a small area of material at the peak of the tooth, it becomes incandescent. And then instead of sharpening or scraping it away, it actually rolls the tooth over, creating a kind of circular surface around the top. And obviously that's not good for plunge cutting. So if that happens, you have to sort of scrape off the top and then start over. So what I tend to do is just bring it over and touch against the grinding wheel, and just scraping away that little bit. You should see sparks coming off of it, but you don't want to see it become incandescent. And that will only happen for a very short period of time because metal is such a good conductor of temperature. So if you just bring it towards the grinding wheel, just touch, seeing the sparks coming off. If you see sparks around the entire top of the tooth, I find that generally means you have a good sharp edge on it at that point. You'll see sparks from this back area right here, and you'll see sparks come just above the tooth itself. And that means you have to have a good contact with the angle of the grinder. So I'm essentially being lazy in the sense that I could probably come up with some kind of jig and get this perfectly aligned so that I'm lined up exactly with the angle of the blade. These angles are probably all a little screwed up now because I've probably ground away too much material. But what'll happen is you'll have a tendency to want to line that up entirely, and then you'll grind away a large area, and then you get the incandescent on the tip, and then you just end up with only a mildly sharp tooth on that. So instead you want to just kiss it against it a few times, see the sparks all the way around the tip, and then do a quick test, and it should feel sort of like a thorn. It should want to stick into you. As you can see here, without cutting myself, I can do this, and it's not really doing anything to my finger. It's just denting it a little bit. You can see how my finger's just sort of sticking to it. It's because it's digging into my skin. It's much more like a thorn. Now, on some of these, I have to repair some pretty serious damage because I've hit so many nails and screws and lag screws, bolts, whatever people have put into the trees. So that's a real problem. So I did sort of remove a lot of material here to try to straighten out that tooth and give me the ability to give it a good edge and to repair the kerf. However, I think that the original kerf on this has an oxide coating as well as being oiled. So I can't really easily add that strong oxide coating it probably had, which is yet another reason to try to just touch on the teeth of this. Just get the teeth sharp, try not to mess with the kerf. Because if it wasn't for the fact that I was lubricating this, I think it would be a much bigger issue with fibers sticking. I've milled some trees that were seasoned outside for a year or so, and with oak I found really no issue with having a pretty bad kerf. The fibers just kind of flew off. It wasn't sticky at all, and even with pine, the resin after a year or two was essentially gone, and so nothing was sticking. And it wasn't until after hand sharpening these with this grinder and then working on a brand new pine tree that I had cut down, I finally figured out that the fibers were just sort of wrapping around it because they were getting stuck, and I think it was from the kerf that I had sort of mutilated. So in some cases you have to mutilate that kerf a little bit to repair the blade after hitting metal, but if you can avoid it, try not to mess with the kerf too much. And if you do, make sure to give it a really good spray with something like WD-40 or some kind of other lubricant. And, halfway through a tree, if you start seeing some of that gumming up around here, then hit it again with the lubricant. try to get that stuff to stop sticking, and your blade's going to last a lot longer. Another tip is if you have a marker or something laying around, make a little mark so that you know when you have completely repeated and are at the end of the wheel. You can often tell also by how shiny the metal is, but it's harder to notice that. I would say that this is an acceptable cut right here. Looks like we're deviating by 2 or 3 millimeters. Again though, what happens is, because these aren't well supported, the 300 pounds or so of the saw part weighs down on it and creates some deflection, which I think is what modifies my angles a little bit. I can say that after sharpening that blade, this is cutting like butter, which is really nice. I am sticking to the WD-40. I'm giving it a little spray before each run, and I think that's helping clear the sawdust a lot better. You can see it fly out at a higher velocity.